On the morning of the 12th of June, 1962, just after 7:15 a.m. during a routine early morning check, a prison guard stormed to his superior's desk. "We either have a dead man or a dummy in the cell block." They hastily proceeded towards cell 150, and after several attempts to wake the inmate, the guard slapped at the head, and to their shock, the head rolled out of the bed and fell to the floor. They looked to the cell located right alongside, 152, and it too had been occupied by a mere dummy. With the possibility of two missing inmates, the guards turned their attention to cell 138, and 2 became 3. The reality of the situation was now apparent. 3 inmates, AZ-1441, AZ-1476, and AZ-1485, had been planning a daring escape attempt right under their noses, and sometime during the night prior, these men had stuffed their beds to mimic the appearance of it covering a body, and placed the dummy head to indent their pillows, and in the dim light of the lights out, their absence had gone undetected, as they escaped through small ventilator holes at the back of their cells. Meanwhile, another guard was beckoned by inmate AZ-1335, who occupied cell 140. The inmate simply said, "You may as well look me up too. I planned the entire escape." What a plan it would have to be, because as the saying goes, break the rules and you go to prison. Break the prison rules and you go to Alcatraz. 2 kilometers off the San Francisco coast and visible from the Golden Gate Bridge lay the United States Penitentiary on Alcatraz Island, or simply Alcatraz. Built on the foundations of Fort Alcatraz, the citadel was repurposed and expanded into a cell house, which would be used as a military prison. Measuring 150 meters in length, the building was, at the time, the longest concrete building in the world. Between 1933 and 1934, the building was modernized, and on the 11th of August 1934, it became the main cell house of the newly opened federal penitentiary. Alcatraz was a maximum security penitentiary intended to house criminals with a severe criminal record, and notably, criminals with a history of attempting to escape. Alcatraz had a reputation for being notoriously tough and borderline brutal, dragging inmates to the edge of their sanity, some inmates preferring to call it Alcatraz. This was due to the harsh living conditions, both intended and unintended, as prisoners were kept in small, sparsely furnished cells, and prison rules were stringent. The inmates themselves were another issue, as some of the most notorious inmates from around the country were housed here. Violence between inmates and towards guards was not uncommon. With this in mind, it's not hard to imagine why inmates would attempt to escape. At the start of 1962, over its 28-year lifespan, Alcatraz had seen 12 escape attempts orchestrated by 31 inmates in total. Of these inmates, 21 were caught, 6 were shot and killed, and 2 were listed as missing and presumed drowned. These escape attempts incorporated everything from simply climbing the fence, filing iron bars, using disguises, cutting through fences, and memorizing patrol patterns, to attacking guards and stealing weapons, as was the case in the infamous Battle of Alcatraz, where, on the 2nd of May, 1942, 6 prisoners took control of the cell house after they overpowered the station guards and managed to enter the weapon room. The battle continued until the 4th of May, at which point the US Marines intervened. 3 of the inmates were killed, along with 2 guards. Of the remaining 3 inmates involved, 2 were sentenced to death, and the 3rd to a second life sentence. While these differing methods had differing results, one thing remained constant. What do you do when you reach the edge of the rock? Nicknamed the Rock for both its rocky environment and its isolation, Alcatraz lay isolated off the shore of San Francisco to the west and south, with Angel Island to the north. With a considerable distance to cover before making it to shore once more, and strong currents making the potential journey an even greater challenge, Alcatraz was deemed inescapable. And true to form, the only inmates who ever escaped the rock and recapture never made it to shore, at least not officially. On a foggy 16th of December 1937, inmates AZ-258 and AZ-260, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe respectively, escaped after filing the iron bars in the mat shop in the Industries building. With visibility hampered, the two inmates escaped unseen and plunged into the ocean. The two men were never seen again, and their bodies were never found. Due to extreme weather conditions on the day, it is highly unlikely that the two men survived, but their fates are ultimately uncertain. In truth, escape was impossible, just as it was always intended. Many had tried, and as many had failed. Born on the 25th of March 1929 in New York City, Alan West regularly brushed shoulders with the law. West found himself in Florida State Prison in 1957 and devised a plan to end his imprisonment. Unfortunately for West, we are discussing him right now, which means his escape was ultimately unsuccessful. West was subsequently transferred to Alcatraz for this escape attempt and became inmate AZ-1335. Here, West would cross paths with inmate AZ-1441, someone he knew from his time in another prison. On the 18th of January 1960, inmate AZ-1441 was registered as Frank Lee Morris. Morris was born on the 1st of September 1926 in Washington, D.C., and was orphaned by age 11. He moved from one foster home to another for the rest of his childhood. Unable to overcome these circumstances, Morris was convicted of his first crime on the 13th of November 1940 and was sentenced to the National Training School for Boys by the Juvenile Court for 6 years, 9 months, and 18 days. Morris would be paroled but violated once more, and on the 22nd of January 1943, he was sent to the Federal Reformatory in Ohio. Morris would serve a sentence for burglary at the Louisiana State Penitentiary from the 19th of November 1945 and was released on the 12th of July 1948. But only half a year later, on the 11th of January 1949, he would be sent to the Florida State Penitentiary on a 4-year sentence for breaking and entering. While here, Morris would escape on at least 3 occasions. During one of these stints as a fugitive, Morris was arrested and charged with possession of narcotics and armed robbery, for which he was sent to the Louisiana State Penitentiary once again, this time for an additional 14-year sentence, which he started serving on the 13th of June 1952. Morris was also given additional sentences for his escapes. By November 1955, Morris was out of prison once again, most likely through escape, possibly on parole, but that's somewhat irrelevant, as he and 2 accomplices attempted to rob a bank on the night of the 24th of November. After making it into one of the vaults, the men were incapacitated by tear gas and apprehended. For this, Morris took a plea deal and received 19 years across 2 counts. This would have been an even greater sentence. While he was being held for this crime in solitary confinement in Louisiana, it was discovered on the 11th of January 1956 that Morris had sawed through his cell bars using a piece of copper tubing and concrete. Morris was charged with this offense, however, this charge was dropped when he entered the plea deal. After this plea deal, Morris was sent to the penitentiary in Atlanta to serve his sentences, and on the 20th of September 1959, Morris again attempted a daring escape with another inmate. While his accomplice escaped, Morris was unable to do so and was caught as he attempted to return to his cell. Morris claimed that he played no part in the escape and, while he would not be charged, this attempt would result in his transfer to Alcatraz a few months later. Overall, Morris's criminal record would include 21 charges. During his time imprisoned in Florida and Atlanta, in the early and late 1950s respectively, Morris made the acquaintance of 2 brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. Clarence, the younger of the two, has his birth date unverifiably listed as May 11th, 1931. Clarence was first arrested on the 2nd of June 1945 for breaking and entering and grand larceny. He was sent to the Florida Industrial School for the next month. Just over a year later, on the 4th of December 1946, alongside his older brother John, whose birth date is unverifiably listed as May 2nd, 1930, the 2 brothers were arrested for breaking and entering, as well as 2 counts of grand larceny. After serving their brief sentences, the brothers would go their separate ways. For Clarence, this led to a 1 to 2 year sentence for burglary on the 14th of March 1950, a 4-year sentence for burglary on the 22nd of June 1951, and a 5-year sentence for breaking an entry with intent to commit grand larceny. He would serve this at the Florida State Prison. Coincidentally, John was also at Florida State Prison at this time as part of a 2-year sentence for grand larceny that he had received on the 15th of October 1951. While outside the prison at a state road camp, Clarence escaped, and when he was recaptured, an additional breaking and entering sentence of 4 years came with it. While Clarence was serving his sentence, John had managed to stay at an arm's distance from the law. That was until their paths crossed once more. On the 17th of January 1958, the brothers, accompanied by another one of their brothers, Alfred, unsuccessfully attempted to rob the Bank of Columbia. For this attempt, Clarence was sentenced to 17 years and John to 10, which they would initially serve at the Atlanta Penitentiary. The pair would eventually be transferred to Leavenworth Penitentiary. On the 8th of October 1960, Clarence attempted an escape by hiding in 2 metal bread boxes, but he was discovered by a steward in the bakery. For this attempt, Clarence was given an additional 2-year sentence. While it was suspected that his brother had aided him in this attempt, investigators could not substantiate the claim. Regardless, on the 24th of October 1960, John became inmate AZ-1476, and 3 months later, on the 16th of January 1961, Clarence would join him as inmate AZ-1485. Alcatraz's main cell house consisted of 4 blocks, each boasting 3 floors worth of cells. Block A had 126 cells in total, but had not housed any inmates since 1952 due to a lack of plumbing. Across the hallway, known as Michigan Avenue, was Block B, housing 174 cells. Block C on the other side of Broadway was identical to Block B. All of these cells had the same dimensions, 1.5 meters wide, 2.7 meters in length, and 2.1 meters high. Sitting across from Block C was a small library, which connected the rest of the cell house with the notorious D block. This block housed only 42 cells and was separated from the rest of the blocks by a wall. Despite these rooms being more spacious, they were not preferred, as these cells were reserved to those who stepped out of line. At the end of the bottom row, cells 9 to 14 were solitary confinement cells. These cells, unlike the rest, lacked any openings. Prisoners were completely walled off, and the cell was closed off with a door instead of iron bars. Inmates were kept in these cells 24 hours a day, with a single visit to the recreation yard per week, alone. Aligned with the 2nd and 3rd floors were gun galleries, where armed guards would be stationed with guns in view of the inmates, but completely safe. The cells were scarcely furnished and had no privacy, populated only by a bed, a desk, a sink, and a toilet. Behind the cells and in between each side of the blocks were maintenance halls, about 90 centimeters in width, where all the piping and wiring to each cell was housed. On the 3rd floor cells remained vacant space. Toward the back, stairs downwards connected the cells with the showers, and a passageway connected the cell section to the cafeteria. The first room encountered was the mess hall, with the kitchen tucked away in a smaller room towards the back. Connected with a set of stairs, the prison infirmary was just above the cafeteria. At the very back, the infirmary contained a set of stairs leading to the roof, populated with vent exhausts and sunroofs. The 4 men occupied 4 cells in close proximity in Block B. The 2 Anglin brothers in cells 150 and 152 shared a wall. A few cells further down the line, Morris occupied cell 138, and directly alongside him in cell 140 was West, who was already gazing towards the sunroofs. On the 5th of May 1961, after being released from the treatment unit, West's mind began to wander, fantasizing about freedom and escape from Alcatraz. West would observe his surroundings and evaluate the possibility of using them to escape, but none of these turned out to be fruitful. That was until West spotted the ventilator pipe running to the roof from his cell block. It was common knowledge among the inmates that there were 8 ventilator shafts running to the roof, although these had been filled up with cement. While painting that area as part of his work detail, West discovered that contrary to the belief of the inmates, these shafts had not been filled up. He realized that this could be his way out. West started discussing the possibility of escape with John Anglin, whom he was acquainted with from their shared time in Florida State Prison in the early 1950s. Younger brother Clarence was soon involved as well. The route was clear. They had to get through the back of their cells to the maintenance corridor, and the ventilator holes underneath their sinks were ideal for this exact purpose. Although much too narrow, they would have to widen them. It was during this time, in December 1961, that Frank Morris joined their efforts and practically became West's partner in the escape. Morris and West knew how seemingly inescapable Alcatraz was. Any plan to escape would need to be meticulously planned out to the finest detail. They must be prepared for the escape from the very first step to the very last. And this required patience, a vital aspect that many before them ignored. This escape plan would not fail what the rest had. It would take something from every page of prior attempts, and would perfect them, and would include pages written specifically for it. There were two issues that foiled previous escape attempts that the four men would have to overcome. What would they do when they reached the edge of the rock? A question that had not been answered yet, and the biggest obstacle that stood between them and freedom. The Anglin brothers were remarkable swimmers, but the waters surrounding Alcatraz were frigid, with maximum temperatures rarely exceeding 17 degrees Celsius. Submerged in those waters, hypothermia would almost certainly kick in after 2 hours, while completely disregarding the effects and dangers of exhaustion. Up to this point, no escapee who opted to swim had ever reached shore. The alternative then was to try to remain out of the water for as long as possible, and for that, the inmates would need a raft. Using a raft had been devised in attempts past, but in every single one of these attempts, the second obstacle would present itself. None of these rafts were ever put to sea, as the escapees were always caught before they could do so, partly due to their absence being noted, and partly due to the time it took to put the raft together. The inmates' escape needed to remain undiscovered until the last possible moment. Morris and his fellow aspiring fugitives would solve the latter part of this obstacle by opting to assemble the raft before they even started their escape. The former issue would pose a significantly greater challenge. It was clear to the inmates that it would be ideal to escape during the night when visibility was at its lowest, and the guards weren't patrolling as often. This minimized the risk of being spotted during the escape. This raised both an opportunity as well as another challenge. On the one hand, the inmates would be expected to be asleep, and if they could fool the night guards into thinking that they were peacefully tucked away in their beds, they would be able to keep their escape a secret until the next morning. On the other hand, this meant that the inmates would have to escape from their cells. With the exception of two, every attempt up to this point had been from outside the main cell house. Those exceptions are the aforementioned Battle of Alcatraz, where the inmates were never able to even leave their cell house, and the other being the attempt by Arthur Doc Barker, William Martin, Rufus McCain, Henry Young, and Dale Stampill on the night of the 13th of January 1939, when they were able to escape the infamous D-Block. Their plan was foiled when in the process of assembling their raft they were spotted by a watchtower guard. When the echo of the gunshots bled away, so did Barker. Stampill was wounded. The only escape the remaining three managed was from injury. They were captured and sent to solitary confinement. If you get the sense that the odds were against them, you'd be completely right. It was by design that the odds were always in Alcatraz's favor. And that's the genius behind this escape plan. If you had a choice between a 1 in 100 chance of escape or a 1 in 10,000 chance of escape, it's pretty obvious which you choose. And to Alcatraz, it was obvious for which they'd be prepared. This plan, unlike the rest, would face a third challenge. The inmates needed a space where they could build their raft without drawing any suspicion. Fortunately for them, the maintenance corridor through which their escape was planned would function ideally for this. At this point, before Morris's involvement in October 1961, West had already attempted to break down the cement with heat using wiring, an idea he got while reading civil engineering books in the infirmary and library. This, however, did not work. The inmates decided to resort to more traditional means by manually digging holes around the ventilator holes and then breaking them into each other, in effect breaking out a large chunk at one time. To do this, they would use sharpened spoon handles, soap, saw blades, and any other abrasive or sharp objects that they could find around the prison. The men chose to work from 5:30 p.m. when the recreation time would begin, and cease their work just before lights out at 9:30 p.m. They worked in pairs to keep watch while the other was working on the ventilator hole, before switching roles, the noise of their work being obscured by the noise of their fellow inmates. They concealed their work by plugging the small holes around the ventilator with toilet paper, soap, and paint, and just before they were able to remove the slab entirely, they painted cardboard to look similar to the back wall of their cells, complete with a false grille. During this time, the inmates also started working on a method to conceal their eventual absence from their cells. Stuffing their bedding was easy enough, but with the relatively low bed position, the guards would see over the entire bed and quickly pick up on the apparent headlessness. Each inmate constructed a dummy head, complete with real hair, using a mixture of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and toilet paper. The first of which was charmingly named Oink, and the second Oscar. In the dim light, these heads would resemble the inmates just enough to fool the night guards. John Anglin was the first to complete the hole at the back of his cell. He placed Oink in his bed, squeezed through the hole, and went to help Clarence with the ventilator gap, concealing the gap in his own cell with a false cement cover. Clarence was the next to finish, and at one point he climbed to the vacant top floor of B block and attempted to unscrew the ventilator coupling, but quickly realized that he could not do it by himself. Fortunately, shortly thereafter, West was tasked to paint in the maintenance corridor close to the ventilator coupling, and using a wrench he had constructed of clamps from his bed, West removed the screws from the coupling. Morris had by this time also finished the gap in his cell, and along with Clarence, the two climbed up the corridor to the coupling. The pair removed it to apply grease so that future removals could be easier, before replacing it once more. The two realized that escaping through the roof would be more complex than they had thought. After removing the coupling, bars blocked their path, and then the lid leading to the roof was also fastened down. For the latter of these, West noticed that bolts similar to those used to fasten the lid down weren't extremely secure and could be loosened, and he believed that it would not cause them too great a challenge. While painting near the barber shop on the island, West stole some of the electric clippers. From these clippers, West made a makeshift electric drill to deal with the bolts. Morris and one of the Anglin brothers tried to use this drill, but they discovered that it was much too weak. Fortunately, the stars seemed to align for West when he was asked to repair a broken vacuum cleaner. He realized that it had two motors. Ever the opportunist, West was able to wire the one motor to run the vacuum cleaner on its own, and he took the other one out. West was able to smuggle the motor to his cell after an altercation in the kitchen distracted the guards and inmates alike. With this new motor at their disposal, Morris and the Anglins attempted to remove the bolts again, but they soon realized that the motor made too much noise and would not be viable. Over the next few days, they were eventually able to remove the bolts through more mechanical means. With their escape from the cell house now mostly ready, they shifted their focus toward flotation devices. For this, the olive rubberized raincoats at Alcatraz were ideal. Over the next few days, West was able to obtain a few. They had decided that the material would be well suited for their raft as well, and John Anglin was also acquiring these coats at the same time. Eventually, they would accumulate about 55 raincoats in total. For the design of the raft and the life preservers, they turned to Morris, who had been reading through engineering articles. In the March 1962 edition of Popular Mechanics, Morris found an article, "Your life preserver, how will it behave if you need it?" And the inmates used this article to aid in their yoke-type designs. With their materials gathered and the designs set, the men began to create their elaborate flotation devices. They cut the coats into pieces and glued them together in the general shape using glue they obtained at the glove factory, and then stitched the edges together. As a means of waterproofing the flotation devices, they sealed the edges by melting them together using the heat from the ventilator pipes in the maintenance corridor. West was able to obtain a few pieces of tubing and use them as valves. They closed the valves off with large paper clips. Morris and the Anglin brothers did much of this work at a makeshift workstation on top of the third tier of cells. They disguised their absence by putting the dummy heads in their beds. Meanwhile, West remained in his cell and did much of the initial work, such as stitching the edges there. The raft was similarly crafted and by its completion measured 4.27 meters in length and 1.83 meters in width. Accompanying the raft were 4 plywood oars. They had nearly all the equipment they needed. Using some mirrors, they constructed a periscope to look onto the roof before escaping. They also managed to acquire about 60 meters of heavy electrical cords spread over 2 equal segments. They would use this to lower their equipment and perhaps even one of the members from the cell house roof. In their time outside the cell house, the men scoped for possible exfiltration points and routes. Their exfiltration point would need to be out of the view of gun towers and searchlights, as well as on the northern side of the island, as they had chosen Angel Island to the north as a destination before they crossed the Raccoon Strait to the north. When they reached the mainland, the inmates would tear their equipment to pieces and dump it back into the ocean, and then steal clothes, weapons, and a car and escape through Marin County. From the courtyard, the inmates could see a pipe run from the ground to the roof of the kitchen. They decided that the pipe would be their way down to the ground. On the evening of the 11th of June, 1962, Morris told West that they were nearly finished and the Anglin brothers were talking about escaping later that night. They only needed to finish the final touches on the raft and separate the bars in the hole leading to the roof. By this time, West was yet to finish the ventilator hole at the back of his cell. As mentioned before, due to West's role in creating the flotation devices, he did not need to leave his cell, and to avoid further risk of detection, West opted to leave his ventilator hole unfinished. In addition, a part of the wall was starting to crack, and with the help of John Anglin, they cemented that section of the wall to disguise the damage. At around 7 PM, Morris and the brothers went into the maintenance corridor and scaled it to the roof to finish the remaining work. And at 8:45 PM, Morris came down to West's cell. They had removed the bars and the raft was ready. They were going to escape if they could get the lid off. Morris went back up to try just that. His attempts were noisy, so West made his own noise in his cell to cover it up. By 9:22 PM, everything was ready, and Clarence tapped on the ventilator leading to West's cell. It was time. West, however, could not manage to remove the remaining cement from his ventilator hole. Clarence attempted to help him, but to no avail. He then went to get Morris, who had just finished clearing the ventilator for their escape. Morris placed his dummy head in his bed and handed West a pipe. West quickly realized that the pipe would make too much noise. His attempts were futile. Morris and the Anglin brothers now had a choice to make. They could return to their cells and postpone their escape another day. They could wait for West to chip away at the hole again and join them. Or they could leave without West. Whether they feared for the success of the escape by postponing, or whether their patience had finally worn out after more than 6 months of work, the 3 men decided to proceed with their attempt and leave West behind, who was desperately trying to widen the hole once more. At 9:37 PM, Morris assured West that he would get Clarence to help them. Morris never returned. Morris and the Anglin brothers took the equipment and continued with their plan. They squeezed through the hole, and their arrival at the roof was signified by a loud crash, heard by the guards. The guard on duty telephonically contacted the control center, who briefly investigated the cell house and infirmary, but found nothing out of the ordinary and resumed their normal routines. The men moved along the roof until they reached the edge above the infirmary and kitchen. Here, they used the pipe running down along the wall to navigate the 50 meters down to the ground. The now fugitives climbed over 2 3.7-meter barbed wire perimeter fences and made their way to the northeastern shore, in a blind spot from searchlights and towers. Here, the inmates started to inflate their raft using an accordion. Meanwhile, West had managed to widen the hole in the wall once more. Desperate, at around 1:45 AM the next morning, West made his way to the utility corridor, where he found Oink, left by his accomplices. After tucking Oink away in his bed, West checked above the cells where the inmates had stashed their materials, and noticed that his equipment was left for him. He also noticed that the heavy electrical wiring was missing. When West finally reached the roof above the kitchen and infirmary and saw no one at the bottom, he realized that they had left without him. West returned to his cell, reclaimed his bed from Oink, and went to sleep. What happened to Morris and the brothers from this point onward is uncertain. With their escape now apparent, the alarms raised, and Alcatraz on lockdown, the manhunt for FBI numbers 2157606 4731702 and 4745119 began. With some of the information which revealed, authorities focused on the waters to the north of Alcatraz and surrounding Angel Island. The Coast Guard dispatched a helicopter and patrol boats to patrol the Bay Area, while the California Highway Patrol was tasked with patrolling the coastline and approaches to the Golden Gate Bridge. Meanwhile, back on Alcatraz, an extensive search effort was underway, and to the north, authorities flooded Angel Island in search of the fugitives. At around 10:15 p.m., the Coast Guard informed the FBI that they had managed to recover a paddle about 90 to 180 meters off the northwestern Angel Island shore. The next day, on the 13th of June, more than 100 soldiers armed with carbines scoured through Angel Island. As the search through Alcatraz's caves and along its shoreline continued, the warden unconvinced that the fugitives ever left the island. The fugitives were not on Alcatraz Island, and neither were they on Angel Island. In addition, on the next day, one of the debris boats scouring the Bay Area advised the FBI that they had recovered what was described as waterproof bags containing photographs, addresses, and water, indicating a leak. It was later concluded that these were the property of the Anglin brothers. On the 15th of June, a life jacket identical to those the inmates had made was discovered on Cronkite Beach. Authorities searched the area, but no additional evidence was found. Crucially, however, this life preserver was in near flawless condition. It had a small tear in one seam that would be sufficient to allow the air to escape, but that was more or less the extent of the damage. If you recall, and as West mentioned to the investigators, the inmates would tear their equipment and dump it back into the water. This life preserver suggested then that the owner of this life jacket did not make it to shore. At around this time, Fred T. Wilkinson, the assistant director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, said, "Information so far leads me to believe definitively that these three men, each of whom I know well from the Atlanta Penitentiary, made it off the island but never made it to shore. The tides and winds that night were strong. These convicts were not the athletic type. Only a trained athlete could make such a swim." The director of the Bureau of Prisons, James Bennett, apparently shared these beliefs, referring to the bag of belongings, as he believed that the inmates would not have abandoned them willingly. Regardless, the FBI continued their attempts to find the fugitives. They would receive many leads, ranging from a woman who spotted three men on a raft, who turned out to be innocent fishermen, to hoax calls. On the 18th of June, the warden at Alcatraz, Olin Blackwell, received a postcard reading, "Ha ha ha. We made it," signed with the names of the three escapees. Unamused, Blackwell believed the card to be a phony. On the 22nd of June, a life preserver matching those the inmates had used was found around 90 meters east of Alcatraz. This preserver had stains that may have been blood and teeth indents on the valve. The FBI speculated that the wearer may have attempted to keep the air from escaping by biting the valve closed. The FBI tested the recovered life preservers as well as the one intended for West. They found that West's preserver was completely airtight and could remain inflated for hours. The other two preservers were able to hold their air for about an hour but slowly deflated due to the damage. They did however foresee the possibility that the preserver could have been kept topped up with air through means of the inmates blowing into the valves. In addition to these, the FBI also recovered the remaining evidence on Alcatraz. These included the life preserver intended for West, an unfinished raft, two makeshift drills, a periscope, a paddle, and about 30 meters of heavy extension cord, all of which were found on the cell block or on the roof of the cell house. On the beach, an additional 30 meters of heavy extension cord was recovered. At around this time, the FBI also noted that they had spoken to police agencies in the area regarding crimes that may have ties to the escapees. West had informed them that they had planned to steal weapons, clothes, and a car when they reached the mainland. No crimes committed in the days following the escape could be linked to the escapees. The plausibility of the escape was still a matter of debate. On the 29th of June, the FBI, with help from the US Army Engineers Office, concluded that the escape would have been difficult. During the night of the escape, around 10 p.m., San Francisco Bay was in slack tide. This meant that the water was not moving in or out of the bay, the calmest the water would be. The water slowly began flowing out of the bay shortly after, before reaching its maximum velocity of around 2.7 knots at around midnight. At the time the inmates would have reached the water, the tide would have been more or less 2 knots towards the west, while the water would have been at a low 12 degrees Celsius. By the 2nd of July, the FBI had secretly started scaling back their investigative efforts, as evidence for their survival was scarce, but they stopped just short of definitively declaring that the inmates had drowned. The FBI was contacted by a couple of crewmates of the SS Norefjell on the 18th of October. The men reported that on the 17th of July, they were approximately 20 miles to the northwest of the Golden Gate Bridge en route to Canada. Sometime between 5:45 p.m. and 6 p.m., one of the crew members spotted an object drifting in the distance. He grabbed the binoculars and immediately identified the object as a human body, which was drifting face down, with its arms and legs dangling into the water. The man was observing the body from behind and could not see the torso. The body was clothed in dirty white full-length trousers. The man called another crewmate and requested that he take a look as well. The second crewmate came to the same conclusion. When the man was shown the trousers that the inmates would have worn, he stated that he was aware of the blue-white trousers that the inmates of Alcatraz wore, and that he was aware that these trousers, when exposed to salt water and sunlight, could bleach to become almost completely white. He did, however, not inspect the body close enough to draw a definitive conclusion. On the 19th of October, the coroner for the San Francisco City and County advised the FBI that it was plausible that the body seen by the crew of the SS Norefjell could feasibly have been that of one of the escapees. He expressed his belief that it would be unlikely that a body would still be floating after 2 months. However, the sighting was only 5 weeks after the escape, placing it well within that estimated time frame. As far as physical evidence is concerned, this would be the last the FBI would receive. The FBI's stance was that they believed a successful escape was made from Alcatraz Island. However, whether the inmates escaped the frigid waters was still up for debate. C.A. Evans wrote, "Price said the intensive investigation is continuing, but as yet no evidence has been developed to indicate that the subjects successfully made their way to the mainland. Likewise, however, there is no information to show that they did not. The paddle, obviously made at Alcatraz, was found between 100 and 200 yards off the shoreline at Angel Island, which is in the bay. The water there is about 12 feet deep. This is the only evidence which may support the conclusion the convicts reached Angel Island, but this is in no way conclusive." The leading theory was, of course, that the inmates never made it to shore and disappeared beneath the water. The FBI inquired about body recovery in the bay, and it was concluded that in cases where people went missing, if the tide was moving into the bay, bodies were usually recovered. However, with an outgoing tide, like in the case of the escape, bodies are rarely recovered. The recovery of the life jacket on the Pacific coast suggested that this may have been the case, explaining why no bodies were ever found. Additionally, the coroner added that in his experience, bodies in the Bay Area usually surface between 8 to 15 days after drowning, if at all, further complicating the search. But what happened in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay on the night of the 12th of June, 1962? The first scenario, and likely the most unlikely, is that the escapees executed the perfect escape plan. The events likely unfolded like this. After making their way to the shore and inflating their vessel, the men boarded and began paddling due north in an attempt to reach Angel Island. By sheer luck, the men realized that the tide was completely calm. They paddled towards Angel Island with little resistance. After some time in the bay, the tide began moving towards the Pacific Ocean, but by this time, the 3 escapees had already done much of the hard work, and after a little more hard work, they reached Angel Island. In accordance with the plan, they traversed the island to its northern shores, before boarding the raft once more and paddling across the Raccoon Strait to the mainland, making sure to leave just enough clues along the way to suggest their demise, and leaving little to no evidence that they actually did make it. Alternatively, this scenario could have been less perfection and more perseverance, losing some gear, belongings, and perhaps even 1 or 2 parts of the third, but at the end of it, all or some of the inmates made it to the mainland and lived as free men. On the 21st of June, the FBI received a letter in which the writer speculated that the inmates might have had outside help, most likely from a fellow prisoner who had been released earlier, and advised the Bureau to investigate prisoners who had been recently released. This was the first mention of outside aid to the escapees. During their investigations, the FBI was informed by an inmate that a guard had been approached by Morris and offered an incentive to aid them in their escape. While these claims could not be substantiated, the scenario where the inmates were aided by an outside source has been greatly speculated on. Supporters of the scenario have suggested a wide array of possibilities, including but not limited to an accomplice waiting for them at the shore, or even waiting for them in the bay itself. The most intriguing of these theories is that the escapees somehow paddled to the docks and attached their raft to the ferry, which pulled them towards the mainland. This theory sounds slightly counterintuitive to me, as their launch position was chosen precisely because it was a blind spot from the guard towers and searchlights. Why would you go towards the docks, which is in full view of a guard tower? I find it highly unlikely that the men could have executed this alternative without being spotted. On the 12th of December 2003, the 11th episode of the debut season of Mythbusters aired. In this episode, the hosts, Jamie Heineman and Adam Savage, attempted the same escape using similar methods, including making their own makeshift raft and paddles, and waiting for similar conditions. They made only one change to their escape. Instead of fighting the current to reach Angel Island, they would use the current to help them reach the main headlands near the Golden Gate Bridge. The two hosts were joined by a third member of their crew. Incredibly, despite the need to manually keep their raft topped up with air, they made it to the intended destination. Using a scale model, the Mythbusters also concluded that it was possible that some of the evidence recovered off Angel Island would have been carried there by a tide originating at the Marin Headlands, suggesting that the inmates did indeed make it. Despite this, neither Adam nor Jamie were convinced that the three men made it. Inspired by the Mythbusters episode, in 2014, a study at Delft University, using a computer model called 3DI, concluded that there was a small possibility that the escapees could have made it to the Marin Headlands, as the Mythbusters had tested. They concluded that this was only likely if the men left Alcatraz Island at midnight, as the tide would have been the most favorable to their efforts. If they had left in the hours before and after midnight, it is almost certain that they would have succumbed to the waters of the bay. Visualizations of both the best case scenario and the worst case scenario in this study are available to the public. I've put the links to both of these in the description of the video. As with any great story, the improbable is usually more exciting than the predictable. But if you allow yourself to step back into the reality in which these events occurred, the results may be slightly anticlimactic. At some point after 10 p.m., the inmates donned their makeshift life jackets and boarded their vessel. After some time, they must have thought that their freedom was inevitable. There was barely any current altering their course. This would be short-lived. The current picked up speed, pushing them out towards the west, the unsteady waves destabilizing their vessel. After some time, their chances of escape looked about the same as their vessel's buoyancy, and soon their deflating life preservers faced the same issue. Despite their best attempts to keep them inflated and to remain above water, they were eventually overcome by the waters leaving San Francisco Bay, never to be seen again. Or perhaps only once by a departing Norwegian ship. The FBI was sure that the escape was most likely unsuccessful and that Morris and the Anglin brothers had most likely drowned in the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay. This belief was in part due to the lack of evidence that the fugitives ever made it to the mainland, especially in the wake of the FBI discovering that no crimes had been committed that could be linked with the escapees. This point is reiterated twice in the FBI document, where the first mention goes as far as saying that writing a report about so many negative results would be of no use. This would be challenged, however, as an apparent teletype from a police station in the area revealed that not only was a blue Chevrolet stolen in the area on the 13th of June, but a car fitting the same description ran another driver off the road, and oddly, this teletype also mentions that contrary to FBI documents, a raft was found on Angel Island. In recent years, this teletype, which I was unable to track down, has been held as evidence that the FBI had overlooked, potentially proving the survival of the escapees. Unfortunately for supporters of this apparent slip-up, the FBI did mention this raft in their official correspondence and were certain that the raft held no relation to the escapees. far as the stolen Chevrolet is concerned, the FBI did investigate several sightings where the witnesses believed they had seen at least one of the escapees driving a blue-green Chevrolet. These investigations seem to have led to nothing, as no more than the initial investigations are ever mentioned. The alleged teletype is just one in a long list of potential lies and misdirection. The FBI receiving dozens of reports that the escapees were seen or even aided. While many of these were investigated, none proved to be fruitful. Recently, newer claims have come to light. As you may recall, a popular theory surrounding the escape was that the escapees were pulled to shore by one of the ferries leaving the island. This theory was suggested by a family friend of the Anglins, Fred Brizzi, who also went on to claim that he had seen the Anglin brothers in Rio de Janeiro in 1975. Brizzi went on to produce a picture he had allegedly taken of the Anglin brothers, among other pictures allegedly taken on a Brazilian farm. Forensic experts working with the Anglin family were convinced that the pictures were indeed taken in 1975 and most likely depicted the two Anglin brothers. However, they could not be completely certain due to the men in the image wearing glasses. In 2019, IdenTV, a company specializing in enterprise AI solutions, fed the picture allegedly depicting the Anglins into their algorithm, hoping that it would be someone akin to using fingerprint identification. The result? The algorithm concluded that the men in the picture were almost certainly the Anglin brothers, more than 99% certain. With my knowledge of AI somewhat lacking, I contacted Professor Tiny Dutoit at Northwest University, who briefly explained how such an AI system would potentially work. Professor Dutoit reiterated many times that he is convinced that the methodology used was accurate and that the only conclusion that can be made is that the men in the picture were indeed the Anglin brothers. I'll leave a link to the transcript of our discussion in the description. The validity of Brizzi as a source has come under scrutiny, including from his widow who, by her own admission, considered her former husband as a con man. She could not recall that he ever mentioned seeing the Anglins. In 2018, a letter allegedly sent to the San Francisco Police Department in 2013 came to light. In this letter, the writer claimed that he was John Anglin and confirmed that all three of the escapees had made it to shore that night. The letter claimed that Morris had died in 2005 and Clarence died in 2008. The author then attempted to bargain with the police, requesting a maximum of 1 year's prison sentence, as well as medical treatment for his cancer, in return for his exact location. The FBI confirmed that the letter had indeed been received by SFPD, and that their laboratory had analyzed the handwriting. The results were inconclusive. While the 4 inmates who formed part of the escape are well known, at least 6 other inmates also might have played a role. According to one inmate, he and another on the 3rd tier were also part of the escape. At one point he was told to stop digging and that he would be informed when he should continue. This order never reached him and he never resumed. The other inmates abandoned the idea of escape. This was corroborated by the holes around the ventilator grills in their cells. Another inmate claimed that he and another kept watch for the escapees for a week before seizing their aid. As for the last 2 inmates, their cells showed similar signs of tampering around the ventilator grills. However, these inmates denied all knowledge of the escape, nor the holes around the ventilator grills. Ultimately, West had never mentioned any other inmates when speaking with the FBI, and distinctly said that they were the only 4 involved. Therefore, I had chosen to omit them from the main part of this video. While the FBI did investigate these individuals, they were never considered serious suspects. It was believed that these inmates merely used the story as a means to be transferred from Alcatraz. Whether these 6 inmates did, at one point, form part of the escape plan is uncertain, and ultimately, you can decide for yourself. Interestingly, the inmate who was interviewed furnished that the Anglin brothers had considered stealing a helicopter. Morris believed that with the knowledge he had built up from books, he could pilot it. They would fly to the California desert, where they would bury a truck body, wherein they would remain hidden until the heat was off, and then make their eventual escape. You can't make this up. Another somewhat funny detail that I had omitted was a letter written to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, on the 13th of June 1962, in which the author writes, "I recall your attention to the fact of the statement that you made when Alcatraz Island prison was built, saying that you would grant a full pardon to anyone who successfully escaped from there. I understand that you men talk a good game of golf, but I cannot help from wondering if the deal still holds. It is very obvious that I am a character, so naturally I am prejudiced. I'm just wondering if the Anglin brothers and Franklin Morris are going to get their pardon. I sure hope so. Mr. Hoover, I realize that you are busy. That is why I took time to refresh your memory. Best regards. The FBI even went as far as refuting these claims internally and investigating the author and whether they had any ties to the escapees. On the other hand, the FBI received a letter dated July 1st, 1962, addressed to Hoover. Dear Mr. Hoover, I'm a boy of 13 wanting some information about the 3 escaped convicts from Alcatraz. Have you found the convicts? How did they escape? Do you think the convicts are still on the island? Or is it the truth what the paper says, that they all probably drowned trying to escape? Please write back soon. Sincerely yours. Remarkably, Hoover wrote back on the 10th of July. Your letter of July 1st, 1962 has been received. In response to your inquiry, the criminals to which you referred have not as yet been apprehended. Since material in our files must be kept confidential, I regret I cannot furnish any other information concerning this matter. In view of your interest, I am enclosing some material I thought you might like to read. Sincerely yours, J. Edgar Hoover. Along with this reply, Hoover sent Story of the FBI, Know Your FBI, The Crime Problem, and Facts about a Career in the FBI. Interestingly, the FBI office in Honolulu, Hawaii, some 3,800 kilometers away, felt it necessary to report that they had not done any investigations regarding the case. You may recall that I mentioned that there were many reported sightings of the Anglins throughout the FBI's investigative efforts. Furthermore, that none of them were fruitful. After a branch of the FBI reported on one of these findings, they mentioned that the woman who made the claims, quote, may be mentally disturbed, to which the lead office responded, quote, your daily teletype summary of the investigative activity should be confined to pertinent items. Information from psychopaths, etc. should not be set forth unless there is some special reason adding national prominence to the report. On the 24th of June 1962, Robert F. Kennedy, brother of then acting President John F. Kennedy, stated that the US government would soon close Alcatraz Penitentiary due to costs. Alcatraz, the most expensive penitentiary to run in the United States at the time, costing more than twice as much per prisoner as other penitentiaries. The deteriorating condition of the prison was also blamed for the escape of the inmates, and costs to upgrade the facility would be upwards of $5 million US, equal to over $51 million US at the time of writing. And, as predicted, on the 21st of March 1963, Alcatraz Penitentiary was closed, where the remnants of the toughest prison in the United States remain today, drawing over 1 million visitors annually. While the fates of those who escaped Alcatraz remain a matter of debate, the remaining members' fate is less so. Alan West was sent to McNeil Island, Washington, after the closure of Alcatraz. West was transferred several times and was eventually released from prison in 1967, before being sent back in 1969 for numerous crimes, for which one of his sentences was life imprisonment. On the 30th of October 1972, West fatally stabbed another inmate. Little over 7 years later, on the 21st of December 1979, West died of acute peritonitis. The FBI officially closed its investigation in 1979, with the conclusion that it was unlikely that the inmates survived their attempt, while the US Marshal Office's investigation continues. Likely, the fates of the 3 Alcatraz escapees will never be definitively ascertained. Personally, I sit firmly in the camp of plausible but improbable. While I completely believe that their attempt might have been a successful one, I don't necessarily believe that it was. Looking at the apparent evidence of their survival, I am completely unconvinced of the validity thereof. The evidence that we do have paints a picture of chaos and failure, as the 3 escapees were most likely overcome by the tides that opposed them. On the other hand, we have a picture that paints the exact opposite. I find it highly unlikely that 3 men who have known only crime their whole lives, whose faces were national and perhaps even international news, would fail to attract attention. Perhaps their tale ends under the waves rather than under the radar.